thank you very much for coming today. Very pleased to have him here to talk about peace-building cities. I was very happy when the idea for this event emerged. Initially, because I felt the lack of this research on how peace building and other peace and security streams of thought have been sort of ignoring or overlooking the specificities of the urban environment very closely when I suggested to the International Review of the Red Cross to write an article on before and after urban warfare. So they were doing a special edition, War in Cities, which came out last year, which I highly recommend that you read. And they invited me to suggest something, and I suggested something on before and after war, urban war. And when I went to look into the literature, I noticed that there was actually very little. It was very difficult to find specific mentions of the urban environment and how urban societies and governance specifically are affected or affect peace building or peacekeeping. We had an event here a few years ago with the UN University, and they, at the time, were very interested as well in this issue of urban fragility, urban environments, and John de Boer, then at the UN University, told us that in the independent review panel for the United Nations, that he was very frustrated because there wasn't any mention of the word urban. So he looked through the document. There was no mention of urban environments specifically. But when you go to look into these, into the literature, into the documents, by many organizations, you see that often what they are talking about takes place in cities. But this attempt to understand exactly how cities shape these initiatives, these peace building strategies, and how security and conflict dynamics are take place specifically in cities, and the forms that they take and how they interact with the urban environment is something that I would say is relatively new, and it's very good to see that Achim has been trying to tap or to close the gap in this knowledge with his new book that is coming out on peace building cities, entitled Urban Safety and Peace Building: New Perspectives on Sustaining Peace in the City. So Achim Wennmann is our Associate Fellow in the Conflict Security and Development Program at the ISS. He also holds the post of Senior Researcher at the Center on Conflict Development and Peace Building of the Graduate Institute of International and Development Studies, and is Executive Coordinator of the Geneva Peace Building Platform. He co-founded the Geneva Peace Week and the Peace Talks initiative. So that's it. Achim, you have about 15, 20, 25 minutes, whatever you prefer, and then we'll have a healthy discussion on this.
Thank you very much, and thank you to all of you to be here this morning. It's a pleasure to share some views and some findings of this research, which is now ongoing for about 3 years. I've been a co-chair of a technical working group on urban safety and peace building, of which the results this summer we managed to write up and present to you in this book form, which is about to get out. So this event is just too early enough to come with the hard copies here. But I was promised the Christmas present to be in my inbox as the year closes. Perhaps as an introduction, I wanted to just chart the regions of how I came to this topic, which are, I think, illustrative of the evolution of the field of peace building and urban safety. And then take some time to unpack the kind of the nexus or the confluence of what practice in that shared space of urban safety and peace building may look like. And then also give some practical examples of recent work where I've tried to go one step beyond from the conceptual elaboration also to some practical work in Mexico and in Syria on this topic. So about 5 years ago, the Swiss Federal Department of Foreign Affairs approached me to host a workshop on understanding the use of dialogue and negotiation with criminal actors. At the time, there was an understanding in the peace mediation community that crime dynamics are very much present in many of the conflict zones where mediators are present, and that led to a reflection to explore what is the kind of ethical and practical space involved of using dialogue or negotiation to diffuse violence dynamics that are associated to criminal violence, not just in Latin American cities, but also in places like the Sahel. Already there was a notion that the actors that are involved in the peace building, peace mediation space are proliferating. That, of course, the notion of mediation of essentially happening between state-based and non-state actors such as rebel groups and so forth was really breaking up, and there were a whole set of new actors involved in conflict settings that needed to have some degree of engagement. At that point, there was one ambassador of one country giving me all the answers of how one can approach this. As he said, in the country that he was posted in, it was absolutely no problem to engage with organized crime because they would all sit in parliament. So it was a state-to-state relationship, which then again was illustrative of the fact of how difficult it is then to, of course, approach this topic with respect to how different individuals and different actors in conflict zones have also different identities and associations depending on the time of day that you engage them with, or the reasons you engage them with. So this was one type of entry into this topic. The other entry happened, as many things happened in Geneva, over a coffee with colleagues from the UN, from UN Habitat, where on the margins of another conference we found out that the urban safety community, so the people who really work on changing urban spaces, changing architectural designs in cities, and those who are working in the peace building field are literally working in separate worlds. And we thought we got to do something about this and see what is in this world of urban safety and peace building. Partly also out of the recognition that there is a shared space and a shared interest, where many of the cities where UN Habitat worked or where violence dynamics occur that are important to UN Habitat would also be places where peace building actors would work. So we identified what that space would be, and lined up this technical working group on urban safety and peace building that ended up including over 100 actors that are working in that space, both from municipalities, from different specialized organizations, including research organizations, local non-governmental organizations, and mediators that have very specific knowledge on specific places, such as how this urban peace building dimension relates to places like Libya, and in particular in Central America as well. So this was somewhat the origin of the process. And one thing that I found surprising was the degree of the separation. And after the 3 years, the degree of the separation keeps on persisting. I've just come back from a fairly large conference of urbanists in Mexico, where the kind of social intervention strategies, the kind of engagement in places, in cities that are completely outside of the reach of government, from the architect's points of view, it's completely another planet. So there is still a lot more work to do the silo busting beyond this technical working group. But let me unpack a little bit of what we found with respect to making sense of that space between urban safety and peace building. So if you are working in the urban safety space, both with Habitat or other organizations, your main focus is on working out urban designs that are less conflict enhancing or more inclusivity enhancing. There are a number of models that exist. Some of the encounter model, which essentially says you have permeable urban spaces where people who live in that space and people from outside that space can more easily mingle. You have, of course, also approaches that argue the opposite. You have the enclosure approach, which is particular those with a Latin America experience know this very well, of all these gated communities which are around. These are well-established architectural urban planning concepts which are well understood. Also, the work of UN Habitat and many other agencies working in that space emphasize the importance of public space. So the recapture of city, making it accessible to the public again, in order to meet people, to have access to street lighting, LED lighting, all of these kind of architectural, physical components that make people feel safer in cities. On the other side, you have in the peacebuilding community, speaking broadly, you have, of course, a history where peacebuilding for many is associated to the management of post-conflict civil war situations in the post-Cold War period. But also there are many who argue that this kind of field has evolved way beyond that kind of very limited understanding. Of course, the United Nations itself, through its sustaining peace paradigm, has opened up the understanding of what peacebuilding may mean and has really resituated the work on peace in the United Nations system to emphasize its importance prior, during, and after conflict. So across the entire conflict spectrum, as well as for peacebuilding to be an effort for all actors involved in a conflict environment, not just the government. So what this means on the city level was that when we digged a little bit deeper, I was very surprised of how many efforts and initiatives exist that use dialogue and negotiation in order to mitigate crime-related violence, communal kind of trust-building efforts from the local community center, from that works on very localized kind of disputes. Neighbor build a wall that is not really, that takes half a meter of territory away from that plot, and it creates ripples. All these kind of localized dispute resolution mechanisms at the city that very much resonate with very classic grassroots peace building efforts, which kind of always have, many of which have occurred in urban settings without them branding these initiatives as urban initiatives. So there was a lot of repackaging and rebranding to be done to make peace builders aware that there is, in fact, a long history of urban type of engagement. But what was the main, if one looks at this a little bit more conceptually, what was the main difference between this was a little bit the theory of change with which they operated. Because from the urban planner and architect's point of view, they very much operated under an assumption that if we are changing the built environment, we will also change the behavior of the people who live in the environment. And there is a fair amount of documentation and research that in the urbanist communities that basically demonstrates or provides evidence that this assumption is really not true. It doesn't work. Violence changes, it continues, and people just don't so easily change their behavior. Now, in the peace-building side, the emphasis has been really on this behavioral side. Peace builders wanting to engage with individuals, perpetrators of violence, victims of violence, in order to change behavior. So you can already see that there is a very useful complementarity of bringing these two communities of practice together. On the one hand, those who really want to work on the built environment and change it to make it less conflict enhancing, and the others really wanting to work on affecting behavior. My colleague Oliver Jutazonka, he tried to express, who's also the co-editor of the book, he expressed this in terms of making a reference to an understanding of how violence reduction occurs under a public health logic, where a lot of what urban safety practitioners are doing relates to palliative care, which is essentially focusing on the symptoms of a disease. and where a lot of what peace builders are doing is about curative care, where you really want to make sure that the causes of the disease are being tackled. It's an interesting analogy because also there's a lot of violence reduction work that happens, making recourse to a public health framing, where you can very nicely make bridges and also find joint vocabulary between the communities that they can understand. Another picture that one may use to understand that difference between urban safety and peace building is imagining yourself in a car, and you are driving, and you want to control the driver's behavior or mitigate the impact of wrong movements in the car. You possibly in the UK as well, you have these ripples on the motorway that if you veer off, the car kind of goes brrrr, no? This is kind of an urban safety approach. You have a change in the built environment that alerts the driver once you get off-road that you kind of veer. No? Same as a safety belt. No? It's a kind of a physical change in the car that mitigates the impacts. No? Whereas the peace builders would say, look, you really should not go behind the wheel if you're so tired. No? Change your behavior. Don't even go into the car. No? So, and I think that's also a nice way how one can understand what it means to engage on the built environment and what it means then to engage on the behavioral changes. So much about unpacking the urban safety and peace building relationship to some extent. Now, if one starts digging down into this topic more practically, one message that very clearly came out of the consultations on the topic is that the distinction between an urban safety community and a peace-building community is very much a distinction that is made in cities like New York, Geneva, London, and elsewhere. But once you hit the kind of the district of Cartuche in Caracas or elsewhere, all of these kind of very fuzzy concepts start to break down. And you have a very interesting kind of attitude of both those in the urban safety camp and those in the peace-building camp, of people on the ground who say, well, we essentially just go on with solving problems, and we don't call them names necessarily. So we don't really have that association if we are working on this from a peace-building or urban planner perspective. We're just going on with solving a problem. So that was interesting, where these kind of distinctions kind of fizzle out as you go closer to the ground. Now, I would like to highlight two elements that I found particularly interesting in terms of practical entry points into this topic. The first relates to the concept or the practice of changing spaces. No, I mentioned already the practice in the urban safety field with respect to building encounter approaches, where if you are just walking around London, you have, for instance, these places which is simply what's it called? The Bürgersteig. Any German? No, the walkway, the pavement. No, where you meet other people. You have Leicester Square. No, you have public squares. You have a lot of interaction with other people. No. You do not go down the way like in many Latin American cities or Asian cities, where from your garage, from your climatized house, you go into your climatized car, you go into the climatized garage, you go into the climatized office building, etc. You don't meet anyone. You have always a degree of separation between you and the other, and particularly between you in the higher or upper middle classes and the rest of society. So you have a very much higher degree of separation, which is associated to this. Now, this is again interesting to see where then also the incentives for exclusion are being built. Where if you go into the reality of most urban places in many parts of the world, they have exclusion being built into the urban design. For peace builders, this is nothing necessarily new. You have research in the peace building world that looks at this in Belfast, in Nicosia, in Jerusalem, and other places where you have tactically organized cities, sometimes out of a military rationale, in order to defend one part of society against another. Or simply you have the urban design that results from the end of a conflict that is then cemented into the city space. And there is a very interesting small literature which is going into this in a very novel and innovative way. So there is, some call it's like the urban turn in peace building. Now, after we had a local turn in peace building, now there is an urban turn in peace building. Peace builders are great to constantly reinvent themselves. So, if one looks at this now for a moment, the notion of spaces from a peace building side, I make reference to a chapter by my colleague Dennis Rogers in the book, who's done a lot of work on gangs in Nicaragua. And he relates one of his experiences where he's an anthropologist that was embedded with a gang in Nicaragua for over a year. That's what anthropologists do. They're embedded with their research community or their research target. And he relates the example of one of his stories where he went with a gang member onto a market to buy something. And he was terribly afraid when he saw a member of another gang member on the market. And he said, "Hey, are you going to do something? What's going to happen?" And his gang member said, "Look, no. You need to understand. We're on the market. The market is nobody's territory. Here we don't find each other. If he would be in this district, we would kill him on sight. If we would be in his district, we would be killed on sight, because this is a territorial gang. But here on the market, this is nobody's territory. So here we leave each other and we coexist, because we both need the market." And this was an example that made us think, and made me think about, that you have these spaces of exception. Even in the most violent and the most difficult territories, you have spaces of exceptions from which you can build a sense of coexistence. And that is, I think, particularly in an age where you have the creation of new enemy pictures. You have the creation of labeling specific groups of being terrorists, gangsters, or whatnot. You have exactly the existence of spaces where you can diffuse these type of very exclusivist portrayals of groups, and where you can work to diffuse these types of labels which are given to groups. I would even argue that from a peace-building logic, you can foster and shape these spaces of coexistence, and over time expand them. I've seen this myself in Mexico, where one head of a small municipality outside of Querétaro, very targetedly planned a public park, a local dispute mediation center, and a health clinic, in a way that he went into these parts of his municipality that were completely out of reach for his police service, for his local police forces, and also his service delivery. And over time, he managed to recapture a part of his municipality that were completely controlled previously by a gang, and managed to absorb a lot of the junior level gang members that wanted to have a different type of life. And most of this really works by including some of the actors and the people who live in the district, and to see what they wanted. They wanted to have the provision of water, without being bribed and extorted by the gang with respect to water distribution, and they wanted to have recourse to some sort of informal or pacific dispute settlement body at the local level. Now, here again, from the peace building side, what is the thing that the urban safety folks cannot bring to the table is where the peace builders have a comparative advantage, is that it is a community that knows how to generate channels of communications to all actors involved in the conflict spectrum, So if it is about managing channels of communications to terrorist organizations, to crime cartels, to gang leaders and so forth, this is all something that is part of the peacebuilding optic. Because not to forget that peace builders who take their work seriously engage conflict systems without precondition. And they engage across the conflict system without judgment of who the individuals are, and based on an independent conflict analysis. So this is what peace builders do. So they don't engage, you're a gang member, so you should be in prison. No, or you don't say, hello, Mr. Terrorist or Mrs. Terrorist. They engage without labeling the actors which they work with. They are not all actors in the peace-building spectrum that keep true to these peace-building principles, but it is still something in the bone marrow of peace-building actors. And the other element is that peace builders are in the constant relationship building. So constant relationship building with prescribed violent actors is something that is also in the DNA of the peace-building world. Now, the other place of convergence, I spoke about spaces, I want to speak about one other thing. It is the use of participatory approaches. In the urban planning and in the architect's world, there is a long history of expertise on planning collaboratively. And there is also a lot of pride in the urban planning community. If you do it right, you do it through a participatory urban planning model. And this is, of course, also something, all of these participatory designs in the peace-building field, from national dialogues, architectures of peace, the peace and development advisors from the United Nations, all of these kind of tools which exist also go in the similar direction. Let me, to close, perhaps highlight two practical examples where some of this work I see is being put to practice. I'm just back from Guadalajara in Mexico, which is a 6 million city, where the ombudsman of the state of Jalisco has understood that he has a role to play with respect to providing violence reduction and prevention work with respect to a human rights, violence reduction, and peace-building optic. This is relevant because Jalisco has become one of the most violent states in Mexico, and at the beginning of a new term of both the national government and the state governments, this has been a very important moment to think about new approaches. And here the peace-building component is particularly thought to be mobilized to reach out and build relationships to these parts of the cities that are really outside the control of the municipal governments, one. And it's also construed to work on these types of conflict and violences that are at the reach of municipal governments. So they've well understood that out of the 100% of violence incidents, under the 100% of violent deaths, there are at least 50 to 60% that municipal leaders can deal with without needing the support of federal actors. Which means that it is not all of the deaths which occur due to the kind of fight between the two cartels in Guadalajara. Some other deaths and also regular delinquencies are much more related to very localized dynamics that the mayor and the municipal authorities can deal with by themselves, pretty much. If they do this well, in the next year or two, they will be able to reduce violent incidents or criminality by at least 50%, which would be a tremendous achievement already. The other example is on Syria, where you, of course, have now a war that is not finished yet, but where in some parts of the country there are reconstruction dynamics, and where particularly the very local level, at the street level, at the municipal level, there will be the biggest needs of finding ways of how to manage that kind of coexistence and also the peace-building space. Once there is a higher degree of refugee returns, when refugees return, there will be all sorts of new conflicts which will be popping up at the very local level with respect to property rights, with respect to managing the feeling of revenge, with respect to also managing livelihoods and competition for livelihoods. There will be a lot of new conflict dynamics which will be taking place that will be very highly localized. And to finding these kind of spaces which I mentioned at the very local level is, I think, one of the most tangible entry points for peacebuilding dynamics in the current Syrian situation. So if there is, for instance, an opening on transitional justice in Syria, it is not about the big national transitional justice campaign, but it is something very highly localized, very highly decentralized, and there is a lot of opportunity to bring in some of that thinking on urban safety and peace building. Surely, and I stop with this, there is also a lot of urban planning taking place right now, with respect to master plans of cities and so forth, which bear all the landmark problems to cement the end of the war into the Syrian cities for the next generation to come, where there is a government that wants to rebuild quickly without necessarily thinking too much about how things are being rebuilt. So now is also the moment for those who have leverage over the government of Syria to recall them that rebuilding could take place in a way that helps cities to become much less prone to violence and resistance over the next few years. Final. Over the last 5 years, this has been the most promising and richest research and practice field in the peace-building world, to my view. Not just is it where most of the conflict dynamics have focused or have taken place, but it is, I think, also the biggest space of prospective conflict dynamics we will see. Partly because at the moment many analysts may be blended by this kind of reinvention of super politics and global power competition between China, US, and so forth. So the international relations realists have kind of they could get back and even at a late age in their life have another job as an advisor. But we shouldn't fool by that. That the real frontier, or one of the real frontiers that will matter to most people, will be at the city level. If we're just looking at Nigeria, if we are looking also to just that moment when China will no longer be in that state of freeze as it is at the moment, that is possibly the Pandora's box for urban safety and peace building. So on that note, I'm going to stop, and I thank you for being here this morning and your diligence to listening to me.
Thank you very much, Achim. I'm going to open up for questions, but I'll start with one of my own. How do we get this message that broader strategies of peace building, of conflict prevention, of stabilization, and even peace operations, that they have to engage with the urban environment and cities? And you cited examples from Mexico, from Syria, and it's not uncommon to see these very promising local level initiatives, especially from the NGO sectors. But when it comes to broader discussions about these issues of conflict prevention, peace building, strategies towards countries like Somalia, like Lebanon, you cited Syria, maybe it's different in Syria, Pakistan, etc. The urban is a bit absent. How do we bridge this gap between the local level and the national broader strategies towards peace building?
Should I take this on right now? Okay.
Any questions now? Oh, we're still waking up, so
no, it's fine. It's fine. There's more coffee in the back, I'm sure, for that. Look, the best way to bridge the divide is for municipal actors and those who are working at the urban level to simply get the job done. To simply go work to reduce violence and build an inclusive society, whether their governments want or not. Just do it. because that is the best form of legitimacy, getting the work done. And I think we've been seeing this, just to revert back to Mexico, there are a lot of extremely successful violence reduction initiatives supported by USAID and other actors. There are, even in one state, in Chihuahua, there's a body called FICUSEC, where the business community has essentially agreed to a 5% tax on whatever the business community does, so that another body provides very innovative violence reduction work that the government would never do. So because the business community lost so much faith in the municipal government, that they just said, look, with your permission, national government, we're just going to go our own way. And it's become one of the models in Mexico, that particularly on the fundraising side. So you have these initiatives. So one response is, don't wait for the national government to give you an okay. I revert back to what nuclear scientists in the Middle East have said in their networking meeting. We nuclear scientists are ready to work for peace. If the governments are, they can join us. So this is the one. You don't wait for the governments. The governments are always the last ones to go on board. Yeah. So this is one. The other one is that I think, if I may use the picture, there is a lot of fascinating spaces that open because of the bad weather system that is above us. In the era of Trump and rising degrees of authoritarian governments, as demonstrated by the varieties of democracies database, many multilateral and national actors are looking to the subnational level to work on their multilateral priorities. I have never seen in the last year so much activities on urban networking in Geneva from across the board, from the Web, from the World Health Organization, from others, because they know this is where our new constituents are. This is where our new interest groups are. And possibly some of the best organized so far, which I see, is the World Health Organization, which have already for many years have very targeted, very discreet, direct working level relationships to hospitals in all sorts of degrees from towns to megacities. And the other community is the disaster risk reduction community, where of course in a rising degree of exposure of cities to very disruptive natural disasters, where there has been an inbuilt match of interest from cities to get the knowledge from the disaster risk reduction communities, expert communities, and where, as a result, there have been already fairly good networks. Now, there are also now in the Geneva environment an understanding that there is so much, on the one hand, there is so much going on that it needs some sort of ordering, but also there are so many places to work that there is really work for everyone for the next 3 generations. Partly because there are so many cities, and there are so many cities that will go over the next decade to their let's call it the edge of resilience. Whether the emphasis of resilience is really just the kind of the expression of this, or this resilience work which is currently happening, or if it is just a buzzword to receive funds from donors to really not do much, that's another question. But I think there is something that responds to your question. Now, the other question is not so much do we need to get the national level in. I think you can simply do perhaps much more effective work by, the question is, do we need the national level? Mm-hmm. So some who work in this area who would say, look, if I have Singapore, New York, Sao Paulo, Mexico City on board for a number of big ticket multilateral topics, I'm good. Governments may still need to sign at one point, but in order to advance practically on the issues, having access on, let's keep on the topic of climate change, to these places, fine enough.
Yeah, and precisely climate change is an area in which cities have done exactly what you suggested. Let's just do it and the governments can join us. So first here and then Francesca.
That's actually fascinating. You're laying out some really good building blocks which can be used, as you say, from the ground up and from other people coming in. Then I was following on, you would use the metaphor palliative care and curative care. Palliative care we know about. Curative care, fine, but people are very prone to infection. And the third part, which is critical, is infection protection. And in the context of what we're talking about in peacekeeping, if you're in a situation where, say, a couple of years after a major conflict, there's huge danger of that conflict breaking out again. There's frequently states which are in a state of turmoil. There's groups of the military which want things to occur. There's non-state or interstate groups which have got elements of them which are trying to get things to occur. Potentially, if you were to take your idea one step further, part of what you should be doing is trying to transmit to the good parts of these various players messages of don't do this, don't do that, because it will interfere with the peace process. You're not going to get them to do really good constructive things, but at least if they know basic healthy procedures, it might reduce or delay the onset of new conflict as a proposition.
Thank you. Francesca.
Thank you.
If you could identify yourselves for the broader
Adrian
Cultural
Institute.
Good morning, Francesca Iandi. I work here at the IISS with Antonio in the Conflict Security and Development Program. I just wanted to slightly push back on what you were saying about the fact that communities can do fantastic things, and then eventually the national government would come along. And trust me, being Italian, I understand that concept very well. And I think it does definitely work to a certain point. Because we know that how the national action can magnify the effect of something that works is unparalleled. There are no other actors that is so pervasive and so big as the government is. But what I find it problematic is really something that I think we need to deal with, and those are the spaces of tensions between the interest of what the community is doing and what the government prescribes. And especially in when we talk about peace building, I think that the very common problem that we encounter is that very often the solutions that come from above are militarized solutions. So I'm thinking of Rio de Janeiro, for example. And so Antonio will know much more than I know about this. But this to me looks like a very clear example of a solution that comes from the government that is going definitely in one direction, that is militarizing the response to the violence problem, whereas the community response is actually that of the peace builders, of the small localized responses. So when you have these tensions, what do you suggest we should approach the problem and trying to solve the tension and actually make the two forces work together toward the same goal? Because at the end of the day, they do have the same goal. I'm just worried they're actually operating against each other.
Yeah, very good question. Diana, and then we'll go back to...
So I'm Diana Klein, I'm Peace and Conflict Advisor Ministry. Thank you. I think this is really interesting. One of the reasons why I'm here, I mean, we had so many of this conversation because I do think that definitely is really behind on this subject, and definitely the peace building community, and partially I think because, you know, I don't want to say the nature of violence has changed, but where violence happens and how violence happens has radically changed over the last couple of years, and I don't think we sort of caught up, because we still kind of, okay, let's have a peace process and a track 2 and a track 3, and we kind of do understand that it's not working. On the other hand, we hit this issue that if we try to come with new approaches to policymakers, then the basic question is where is the evidence that this works? And we don't have that, because we don't know whether it works, because things are changing so rapidly, and we sort of need to kind of build this up. So, and that's why I'm also really, really interested in your work and these type of things. And I was wondering if you can unpack a bit your point on transitional justice in Syria or in other places, because we just did recently a study in Iraq on transitional justice in Nigeria and Somalia, and the things that are coming out of Iraq are just horrific in terms of the need and the fact and the way people are taking transitional justice, what they think is justice, into their own hands. And if you look at cities like Mosul and other places where the reconstruction efforts are purely seen from this kind of vertical rebuild houses, etc., are very, very technical, logistical approaches. And my worry is that the peace building community is not there. We're not considered as somebody who needs to contribute and, in fact, go hand in hand with the reconstruction efforts, because it's so militarized and it's such a technical exercise. And the point on going one step or one level below the national and just looking at planning municipalities, I think that's also something that is not on our radar. And how can we bring this point out a little bit more in the future?
Okay, so let me take this in the order that the comments came on the infection protection, or I would call also the vaccination. I think in many, it's not just related to post-conflict environments, but it's related to our own societies, where we have rises in nationalism, rises in exclusion, and so forth, where many politicians and us as members of our own societies, we tend to sometimes forget that a peaceful or a working society requires a constant investment at this. And that it goes beyond the city level, also in rural district, which is essentially there, I would say, a vaccination campaign against drivers of violence and exclusion, which includes the assurance of checks and balances, which includes the assurance of transparent mechanisms of decision making and politics, and also the constant relationship building across different parts of society. Particularly, I think this notion of vaccination has been mentioned in Canada, with respect to how Canada is assuring a multicultural society through a lot of localized mediation approaches, a lot of social programming, and so forth. So you see how this kind of vaccination is breaking off, even in many European countries. And where you have vaccination failures, such as in Hungary, where one major university is being booted out. And as an academic, that for me is a red flag, but a deeply red flag, of where I wouldn't have thought I would see this in my lifetime in Europe, but it happened. So this goes into the direction of how. And also that goes into the rationale of the sustaining peace logic of the Secretary General, that we don't only need to invest if things are already pretty bad. We need to also invest in systems and societies and cities that are perceived to be not as bad. And it's just to relate to that, there is the inbuilt inefficiency in the multilateral assistance and donor world, that they nearly only fund things that bleed. We had a human rights defender from Malaysia during Geneva Peace Week in Geneva who said, look, I've been in Geneva over 15 years. We were very kind of excited once to have a 1-minute slot in the Human Rights Commission to do a statement. But we didn't bleed enough, so neither the international community at large, nor the UN, nor Western NGOs would like to take our case, because there was always someone who would bleed more. And that's the kind of situation where one has to assure the vaccinations are being kept up, even though no one else really helps. So that's that. On the on your point of how much expectations we can really place at local level activities, when the conflict systems are so big that they kind of crush these local level dynamics. It's the mayor of Fukushima problem. I built a 10-meter defense wall against floods, and the wave was 15 meters high. What do I do? So I think And it relates to the vaccination point. At the municipal level, you can work to insulate yourself, to work on some type of dynamics. But also then you need to create these horizontal and vertical relationships beyond your municipality of the conflict drivers that have impact in your municipality. I think the architectures of peace framing captures this very adequately. Now, any mayor knows that if he or she only has relationships within the community, they will not necessarily be doing a good job. But they also know, and what I heard in Mexico makes me very, very, gives promising signs, to put also much more responsibility on those outside of their systems for things that happen in their environment. So there is also a mutual passing the buck over to one side or the other, which can sometimes conflate. That is not helpful to finding out who is responsible for what and who can do what and who should do what. So now that goes back into a systems perspectives on conflict and where of course where are the parts of the system you can manage at what level. But ultimately you need these kind of architectures of peace arrangements in order to have different levels of the conflict systems communicate to each other. There, the role of the outsider, of the international component is important because they can drive these architectures of peace to an extent or accompany them to an extent that many local actors can't. So the external neutral accompaniment person that such as actors like Kofi Annan, the Kofi Annan Foundation, the elders or others who've been so instrumental in doing that work to facilitate the relations between national actors and local actors or between conflicted actors at the national level. On the third one, yes, many donors are behind, not just DFID. The Swiss are only waking up to the topic. They've been working now on this, the Swiss Development Corporation, for the last year or so. The furthest advanced I see in this topic are the Germans, the GIZ. They have a project on cities and peace, which is moving on and is building on their work in South Africa. But to detail a little bit more the notion of transitional justice in Syria, is what I wanted to get at is that I think a lot of the new localized conflict dynamics, a lot of the spaces where people will really need to come to grips with their own exit from pain and into a sort of a coexistence or justice feeling will happen at the very local level. There are, of course, some who say we need some degree of very high-level justice of the core perpetrators for us to feel better. But even if that happens, the experience of justice will happen in the experience of daily life. And that happens on the way to the bakery. It happens for the kids to be able to go to school, how they go to school. It will happen on the market and these type of spaces. So from a very human type of perspective, I think thinking about transitional justice in very localized terms and how people experience their daily lives in the city is important. And it is in the city because most of the return, if it happens and when it happens, will go to cities.
We have time. We have time for. I'll push it to two questions, and they have to be very quickly rapid fire questions. So the two people that pick, I'll extend to three. So you, then you, and then yeah.
Rabia from International Alert. There's been a lot of sort of focus, and you've also talked about a lot of cities in post-conflict settings. But have you sort of also looked at cities which are growing at organizations like Rapid, taking Lahore for example, where I come from, which also have a colonial legacy? That means a lot of structural violence exists. And has there been also any work done on that, and what peace builders would play a role in that?
the architecture of peace building, I think, cities, looking at your book and the content of the book, I don't see empowerment of city networks. What we need is statements to the global community that cities have best practice to connect. And until we build some formal connections for conflict cities, cities that have this experience to share and affirm to the international community that we have a network of cities that have experienced pain and suffering and will do in the future, we're not still going to have that statement.
Very good point, Bruce.
Eating from King's College London and Terrorism. I'm interested in the participatory urban planning model you just mentioned. So I just wondered if you have any examples or cases to share with us, especially using some of the citizen participatory data, for example, crowdsourcing data. If in that case you have, do you have any suggestion to turn it into some policy-driven strategies?
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Very quickly, please.
Examples on urban planning models. Cape Town and Cologne are the biggest examples here. Social room planning in Cologne has been ongoing for the last 10-15 years and has recently received an infusion of 50 million euros a year after main incidents which happened in the city. Cape Town, similarly, long history of participatory urban planning, particularly with very violent districts. Empowerment of networks. I see the call for the empowerment. One thing that I don't see is the high net worth individual who's going to put up the hundreds of millions of dollars that will make these networks to have a clear international political role. I see many networks, some of them tremendously inefficient, such as the big one, the UCLG. And I see some networks of big cities, of the kind of the 5 million plus, that have starting to make political impact. But the multiple thousands of small, medium-sized cities are still orphaned on the city networking stage, and that brings me also to your city examples. There is research. I think my colleague Dennis Rogers has done a lot of work on getting out of violence dynamics in Indian cities. So there is a lot of anthropological work which has been done. And there is also, of course, in India, a lot of civil society mobilization of the best kind at the city level. The entire women empowerment movement is partly an urban-based movement, which very much works against violence against women. So that is also something to look at. And that perhaps as a concluding statement or a concluding observation, I found that if one gets beyond the labels of urban and peace building and also others, one sees how much work that is not necessarily called peace building or urban safety is already happening in cities. It is not necessarily about having new programs or new initiatives in cities, but really to understand what is happening at the civil society level, at the very local level. What is the local agency in order to see what already happens? Because if there's one thing that I've seen is people in difficult districts, they don't wait for anyone to kind of come in and do the work for them. They're self-organized. Up to the degree, as you said, to what they can. But what they can, they will do. And that's, I think, an interesting element to reflect on as when we sit in London or elsewhere, we don't necessarily perceive what is already happening in so many difficult places.
Thank you very much, Achim. We did what we could here. Thank you, and please join me in thanking Achim for this very good talk.